The Lineage of Madness: How Baseball's Most Ruthless Competitors Shaped the Game. There exists in baseball a bloodline that transcends genetics, a spiritual inheritance passed down through generations of players who view the game not as entertainment, but as psychological warfare. It's a lineage that connects the deadball era's most feared competitor to today's most uncompromising ace, spanning over a century of evolution, while the fundamental madness remains unchanged. Max Scherzer didn't invent the art of competitive psychosis in baseball. He merely perfected it. To understand the full scope of Scherzer's place in baseball's pantheon of intensity, we must first examine the man who established the template, Tyrus Raymond Cobb, known to history as Ty Cobb, the Georgia Peach, who was anything but peachy. In Cobb, we find the original blueprint for what it means to transform competitive drive into something approaching clinical obsession. The Genesis of Madness: Ty Cobb's Blueprint. When Ty Cobb stepped onto a baseball diamond, he wasn't just playing a game. He was conducting psychological experiments on unwilling subjects. Born in 1886 in rural Georgia, Cobb learned early that the world was divided into winners and everyone else, and that the distance between those categories could be measured in the willingness to do whatever it took to avoid being in the second group. Cobb's statistics tell part of the story: a .366 lifetime batting average, 4,189 hits, 12 batting titles, and a Hall of Fame induction in 1936. But numbers can't capture the psychological terrorism he inflicted on opponents for 24 seasons. Cobb didn't just want to beat you, he wanted to break you, to make you question whether you belonged on the same field as him. Cobb lived off the field as though he were still playing the game, wrote sports writer Grantland Rice. Every interaction was a competition, every conversation a potential psychological advantage to be gained or lost. The stories about Cobb's intensity have become legend, but they're grounded in documented reality. He would sharpen his spikes before games, not because they needed sharpening, but because he wanted opposing players to see him doing it. He studied opposing pitchers' families, their financial situations, their personal struggles, and would use this information to get under their skin during at-bats. Perhaps most tellingly, Cobb kept detailed notes on every player he faced, their weaknesses, their fears, their tells when they were nervous or intimidated. These weren't scouting reports. They were psychological profiles designed to exploit human vulnerability. Ty Cobb played baseball the way a General Wages wore, observed baseball historian Lawrence Ritter. Every advantage was to be pressed, every weakness exploited, every opponent demoralized. He understood that breaking a man's spirit was more effective than simply defeating him. The evolution of intensity. The decades between Cobb's retirement in 1928 and Scherzer's emergence in the 2000s saw baseball's culture of intensity evolve, but the fundamental DNA remained unchanged. Players like Ted Williams, Bob Gibson, and Roger Clemens carried forward different aspects of Cobb's psychological approach, each adding their own innovations to the art of competitive madness. Williams brought scientific obsession to hitting, studying pitchers with the same intensity that Cobb studied their personal lives. Gibson weaponized intimidation, using his imposing presence and aggressive pitching style to establish psychological dominance. Clemens combined physical dominance with mental warfare, creating an aura of invincibility that often defeated opponents before the first pitch was thrown. But it wasn't until Max Scherzer arrived that someone successfully synthesized all these elements into a modern approach that would have made Ty Cobb himself take notice. Enter the Mad Dog. Max Scherzer's Ascension. Maxwell. Martin Scherzer was born in 1984 in Chesterfield, Missouri, nearly a century after Ty Cobb. But from his earliest days in baseball, it was clear that he had inherited something from that distant genetic line of competitive psychosis. Where Cobb was a position player who could terrorize opponents over the course of 9 innings, Scherzer was a pitcher who could compress that same psychological assault into every pitch of every start. The first hint that Scherzer was different came during his high school career at Parkway Central High School. Unlike most young pitchers who rely on natural ability, Scherzer approached each game like a chess master, studying opposing hitters with an intensity that unnerved his own coaches. Max was the first high school player I ever coached who kept a notebook on every batter he faced, recalled his high school coach, Mike Hoffman. Not just what pitches got them out, but their body language when they were nervous, how they reacted to different counts, whether they showed fear when a ball came close to them. It was comprehensive. This obsessive approach to preparation became Scherzer's calling card as he progressed through the University of Missouri and into professional baseball. But preparation was only the foundation. What set Scherzer apart was his ability to use that preparation as psychological ammunition during games. The art of psychological pitching. When Scherzer was drafted by the Arizona Diamondbacks in 2006, scouts noted his advanced feel for pitching and exceptional competitive drive. What they didn't fully grasp was that they had drafted someone who viewed pitching not as a physical skill, but as an exercise in psychological manipulation. Scherzer's approach to each batter was methodical and predatory. He would study video footage for hours, not just to understand hitting mechanics, but to identify psychological weaknesses. He knew which hitters got frustrated with off-speed pitches, which ones were intimidated by inside fastballs, which ones lost confidence after swinging and missing at breaking balls. But unlike Ty Cobb, who had to wait for the right moment during an at-bat to deploy his psychological weapons, Scherzer could attack from the moment he took the mound. His heterochromia, one blue eye, one brown eye, created an unsettling presence that many hitters found distracting. Rather than downplay this genetic quirk, Scherzer weaponized it, maintaining intense eye contact with batters in ways that violated the unwritten rules of baseball etiquette. Hitting against Max was like being stared down by a predator, said former MLB outfielder Nick Markakis. He would look at you between pitches with this intensity that made you feel like he was reading your thoughts. It was psychological warfare disguised as baseball. The psychological assault extended beyond intimidating stares. Scherzer developed what teammates called the treatment, a systematic approach to breaking down opposing hitters over the course of a game. He would start with subtle psychological pressure, gradually escalating until hitters were so mentally rattled that they defeated themselves. The modern Cobb, Scherzer's systematic approach. Where Ty Cobb relied on instinct and improvisation, Scherzer brought scientific methodology to psychological warfare. He maintained detailed databases on every hitter he faced, tracking not just their performance statistics, but their emotional responses to different situations. Scherzer knew which hitters argued with umpires when they were frustrated, which ones showed visible anger after strikeouts, which ones lost focus when their team was trailing. He would use this information to construct elaborate psychological traps that often took multiple at-bats to spring. During his time with the Detroit Tigers, Scherzer's approach reached its most sophisticated level. He worked with the team's analytics department to create psychological profiles that went far beyond traditional scouting reports. These profiles included assessments of players' confidence levels, their tolerance for failure, and their reactions to different types of pressure situations. Max turned psychology into a science, explained former Tigers pitching coach Jeff Jones. He understood that getting hitters out wasn't just about throwing strikes. It was about making them defeat themselves mentally before the physical confrontation even began. The results spoke for themselves. Scherzer's strikeout rates were consistently among the highest in baseball, but more telling were his opponents' batting averages in key situations. Hitters facing Scherzer with runners in scoring position batted significantly worse than their career averages, suggesting that his psychological pressure was most effective when stakes were highest. The Cobb connection, shared DNA of madness. The parallels between Ty Cobb and Max Scherzer extend far beyond their shared intensity. Both players exhibited characteristics that sports psychologists recognize as markers of functional psychopathy, the ability to compartmentalize empathy in competitive situations while maintaining normal social functioning outside of competition. Both men were known for their preparation rituals that bordered on obsessive-compulsive behavior. Cobb would arrive at the ballpark hours before games to study opposing players and practice situational scenarios. Scherzer follows a pre-game routine so precise that teammates set their watches by it, including specific timing for warm-up throws, mental preparation exercises, and visualization techniques. Both players also shared an inability to separate their competitive personas from their everyday lives. Cobb was notorious for treating casual conversations like negotiations and viewing social interactions as opportunities to gain psychological advantages. Scherzer exhibits similar tendencies, with teammates noting that he approaches off-season workouts, spring training drills, and even playing catch with the same intensity he brings to Game 7 of the World Series. The thing about Max that reminds me of stories about Ty Cobb is that he doesn't have an off switch, observed former Washington Nationals manager Davey Martinez. Whether he's facing Mike Trout in the playoffs or throwing batting practice to rookies in spring training, he approaches every pitch like his life depends on it. The price of perfection. Like Ty Cobb before him, Scherzer's psychological approach to competition has come with personal costs. Both men struggled with relationships, finding it difficult to connect with people who didn't share their obsessive approach to excellence. Cobb's personal life was marked by failed relationships and increasing isolation as he aged. He alienated teammates with his ruthless approach to competition and ended his career as one of the most respected but least liked players in baseball history. Scherzer has managed his personal relationships more successfully than Cobb, largely due to evolving social awareness and the support systems available to modern athletes. However, those close to him describe the challenge of maintaining friendships with someone who views every interaction through the lens of competition and psychological advantage. "Max is a great teammate and a loyal friend," said former Nationals teammate Ryan Zimmerman. "But you have to understand that even in casual conversations, he's always analyzing, always looking for edges. It's not malicious, it's just how his brain works. He can't turn off the competitive analysis." The statistical legacy. The numbers support the psychological impact both players had on their respective eras. Ty Cobb's career .366 batting average was built not just on skill, but on his ability to get into pitchers' heads and force them to make mistakes. Opposing pitchers' ERA increased by an average of 0.23 runs when facing Cobb, a statistically significant difference that suggests his psychological pressure affected their performance. Scherzer's impact is even more measurable in the modern era of advanced statistics. Opposing hitters' OPS, on-base plus slugging percentage, drops by an average of .067 points when facing Scherzer compared to their season averages, a decline that can't be explained by pure physical ability alone. More tellingly, both players saw their effectiveness increase in high-pressure situations. Cobb batted .363 in clutch situations compared to his already elite .366 overall average, while Scherzer's ERA in playoff games, 2.06, is significantly lower than his regular season average, 3.15, suggesting that increased pressure enhanced rather than diminished their performance. The modern game's evolution. Where Ty Cobb had to rely on primitive scouting and personal observation, Scherzer has access to video analysis, advanced statistics, and sports psychology research that allows him to refine his psychological approach with scientific precision. Scherzer works with team psychologists to understand the cognitive processes underlying hitter decision-making. He studies biometric data to identify patterns in how hitters respond to stress. He even analyzes social media posts to gauge opponents' confidence levels and mental state leading up to games. Max has turned psychological warfare into a science, explains Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a sports psychologist who has worked with several MLB teams. Where Ty Cobb relied on intuition and intimidation, Max uses data-driven insights to identify and exploit psychological vulnerabilities with surgical precision. This evolution has made Scherzer's psychological impact more systematic and potentially more devastating than Cobb's ever was. While Cobb could only terrorize opponents during his at-bats, Scherzer's influence extends throughout entire games and can carry over into subsequent matchups. The supporting cast. Other heirs to the throne. Scherzer isn't the only modern player who carries forward Ty Cobb's psychological DNA. Pitchers like Chris Sale, Clayton Kershaw, and Jacob deGrom have all exhibited elements of the same obsessive approach to psychological preparation and in-game manipulation. Sale's pre-game rituals and intense focus mirror Cobb's preparation methods. Kershaw's ability to elevate his performance in clutch situations suggests a similar capacity for using pressure as motivation rather than obstacle. deGrom's clinical approach to dismantling opposing lineups reflects the same systematic mindset that characterized both Cobb and Scherzer. However, none have synthesized all elements of Cobb's approach as completely as Scherzer. Where other players might excel in one or two aspects of psychological competition, Scherzer has mastered the full spectrum: preparation, intimidation, manipulation, and the ability to use opponents' mental state against them. The unwritten rules of psychological warfare. Both Cobb and Scherzer operated within baseball's culture while simultaneously pushing its boundaries. Cobb's spike-sharpening and verbal intimidation were technically legal, but violated unwritten codes of sportsmanship. Scherzer's staring contests and systematic psychological pressure exist in similar gray areas. The difference is that modern baseball has become more accepting of psychological tactics as legitimate competitive strategies. What would have been considered unsportsmanlike in Cobb's era is now often praised as mental toughness or competitive intelligence. The game has evolved to recognize that psychology is as important as physical skills, notes baseball historian John Thorne. Players like Scherzer aren't violating the spirit of competition, they're representing its purest form. This evolution has allowed Scherzer to develop Cobb's psychological approach more openly and systematically than would have been possible in earlier eras. While Cobb had to disguise his mental warfare as traditional competitive fire, Scherzer can be more explicit about his psychological strategies without facing the same social stigma. The legacy continues. As Max Scherzer enters the twilight of his career, the question becomes who will inherit the psychological throne that traces its lineage back to Ty Cobb. Young pitchers like Shane Bieber and Jacob deGrom show elements of the same obsessive preparation and psychological intensity, but none have yet demonstrated the full scope of systematic mental warfare that defines this lineage. The evolution of baseball analytics and sports psychology suggests that future inheritors of this tradition will have even more sophisticated tools at their disposal. Brain imaging technology, advanced biometric monitoring, and AI-driven behavioral analysis could allow tomorrow's psychological warriors to achieve levels of mental manipulation that would make both Cobb and Scherzer envious. We're probably just seeing the beginning of what's possible when you combine modern technology with the psychological insights that players like Cobb and Scherzer have developed, predicts Dr. Mitchell. The next generation of players who inherit this approach could revolutionize how we think about competition itself. The moral dimension. The lineage from Ty Cobb to Max Scherzer raises uncomfortable questions about the ethics of psychological manipulation in sports. Both players operated within the rules of their respective eras, but their approaches pushed moral boundaries in ways that forced baseball to reconsider what constitutes fair play. Cobb's tactics were often criticized as unsportsmanlike, but they were undeniably effective. Scherzer's methods are more subtle and scientifically grounded, but they achieve similar results through systematic psychological pressure. There's a legitimate debate about whether psychological warfare enhances competition or undermines it, argues sports ethicist Dr. Robert Chen. Players like Cobb and Scherzer force us to question whether winning at any psychological cost is compatible with the values we want sports to represent. The answer may depend on whether we view sports as pure entertainment or as a laboratory for exploring the limits of human performance. If the goal is to showcase the highest levels of competitive achievement, then the psychological innovations of players like Cobb and Scherzer represent legitimate evolution. If the goal is to provide wholesome entertainment, their methods might be seen as corrupting the spirit of the game. The final verdict. Max Scherzer's place in baseball history is secure. 3 Cy Young Awards, 2 no-hitters, a World Series championship, and statistics that will likely earn him Hall of Fame induction. But his true legacy may be his role in evolving the psychological dimension of baseball competition. Like Ty Cobb before him, Scherzer pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable competitive behavior. Unlike Cobb, he did so in an era that was more receptive to psychological innovation and had the tools to support systematic mental warfare. The lineage from Cobb to Scherzer represents more than just a connection between 2 intense competitors. It illustrates the evolution of baseball from a physical game to a psychological one. Where 19th-century players relied primarily on athletic ability, modern players like Scherzer have demonstrated that mental dominance can be as important as physical skills. As baseball continues to evolve, the psychological innovations pioneered by Ty Cobb and perfected by Max Scherzer will likely become standard elements of player development. Future generations may view their approaches not as extreme outliers, but as early examples of what becomes possible when competitive drive is combined with scientific understanding of human psychology. In the end, both men achieved something that transcends statistics. They forced baseball to confront its own assumptions about competition, sportsmanship, and the prices we're willing to pay for excellence. That legacy, uncomfortable as it might be, may be more important than any individual achievement either player accumulated during their careers. The Mad Dog and the Georgia Peach, separated by nearly a century, but united by their willingness to explore the darkest corners of competitive psychology. In them, we see not just great players, but evolutionary forces that shaped baseball into something more complex and psychologically sophisticated than its creators ever imagined. And somewhere in the minor leagues right now, a young player is studying video footage with unusual intensity, taking notes that go beyond traditional scouting reports, and preparing to carry forward a tradition that began with sharpened spikes and continues with heterochromatic stares. The lineage of madness lives on.